Most viewers are probably aware of the history of the slave trade and the ships used to transport humans as part of that trade. Images of these ships with rows of people cruelly stuffed like cargo are well known. Japan has long had a troubling phenomenon that is called the modern slave ships. This is the rush hour overcrowding of commuter trains in major cities such as Tokyo and Osaka. It's a sight that can leave tourists visiting Japan with culture shock. Surprisingly, overcrowded trains in Tokyo were recognized as a problem even before the Second World War, and the problem persists 100 years later. Many of the people who work in Japan's cities are forced to ride these slave ships to their jobs. In this video, we'll take a look at the crazy problem of Japan's overcrowded trains. On this channel, we'll cover some of the lesser-known topics of Japanese culture. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe. Workers in Japan's cities have long suffered from the problem of terribly overcrowded commuter trains. It's at its worst in Tokyo, one of the largest cities in the world. As a measure of the crowding of trains, there is a number known as the occupancy rate, which is the actual number of passengers in a carriage relative to the number of passengers the carriage is designed for. In general, trains are considered to be 100% full when all seats are occupied, and all straps and rails for standing passengers are also used. In a typical Japanese railroad carriage of 20 meters in length, that's about 140 passengers. But the occupancy rate for trains in the Tokyo metropolitan area can reach 150% to 200% at peak times. 150% occupancy usually means that passengers are always physically touching neighboring passengers. 200% means they are pressed against each other. Commuting every day while being pressed against total strangers can be a very stressful thing. It can leave you exhausted by the time you get to the office. Amazingly, many workers and students in Japan's large cities consider this a normal part of life and experience it every day. That's hard to believe. Astoundingly, there was a time when the occupancy of some Japanese trains reached 270%. According to data from 1986, parts of the JR Joban line in Tokyo had an average occupancy rate of 271% during parts of the day. At a 270% occupancy rate, it can be so tight that it's impossible to move, and when the train sways, everyone leans over in a bundle, nearly to the point of suffocation. Today, Japan's population is decreasing due to the aging population, and the number of workers is also decreasing. The rail network within Tokyo has been expanded too, so the occupancy rates have gone down, but even then, they can reach 200%. Why is Japan unable to eliminate this problem, and why don't people raise their voices against this oppressive situation? In fact, Tokyo has had the problem of overcrowded trains since 100 years ago. Japan had its first streetcars in 1903, and the increasing urbanization drew large numbers of passengers, quickly leading to overcrowding. A popular song from 1918 called Tokyo Bushi included lyrics complaining about the overcrowded trains, proving that it was part of the urban landscape even back then. After that, with the high economic growth after the war, Tokyo developed rapidly, with its population growing from 3.5 million in 1945 to 10 million in 1962. In 17 years, it grew threefold. This led to overcrowded trains becoming a serious problem. Statistics on train occupancy were not kept at that time, but it is believed that it was around 300% using current standards. In 1961, a Japanese magazine published a feature article titled "I'm Being Crushed by a Killer Train." Japan has long been plagued by the issue of excessive work hours and low wages. Adding an awful commuting environment to this makes for a terrible strain on workers. After this, the urban rail network expanded, reducing the occupancy rate, but even in the 2000s, the most crowded lines hit 200% occupancy. With the working population reduced from the 2010s, the worst of the crowding lessened, but lines like the Tokyo Metro Tozai line and the Odakyu line maintained occupancy close to 200% since the 1990s, with little easing up over 20 years. Why are crowded trains so much a part of Japanese cities? These are some of the possible causes. First, there's too much concentration of population in the cities. In 2005, Japan recorded its first population decline after the end of World War II, and it remained somewhat level after that, but since 2011, it has been on a steady downward slope. Nonetheless, workers continue to concentrate in the cities, and Tokyo's population is still growing. As stated earlier, the population of Tokyo first exceeded 10 million in 1962 and continued to grow to its current figure of 14 million. The area encompassing neighboring prefectures is called the Tokyo Metropolitan Area and has a population of 38 million, easily the most populated area of this kind in the world. By the same standards, the comparable figures are 20 million for New York, 22 million for Shanghai, 25 million for Delhi, and 31 million for second-ranking Jakarta. This should give you an idea of how densely packed Tokyo is. Tokyo's rail system is considered the world's most packed rail system, while also the most on time in operation. But with the largest urban population in the world, it's difficult to solve the problem of overcrowded trains. Nonetheless, there are some ideas on how it can be solved. For example, promoting remote work, changing starting times for jobs, and flex time. Unfortunately, it's difficult to widen these practices in Japan. Japanese people have a strong tendency to value harmony with those around them. Many would have a sense of guilt about starting their workday at 11 o'clock when everyone else starts at 9. And many in upper management of Japan's major companies believe that they can't evaluate their subordinates if they can't see them. This is related to Japan's work philosophy of valuing long work hours and fidelity to the company over productivity. With remote work or staggered work hours, managers can't keep an eye on their subordinates. That's why management requires that all employees arrive at work at the same time. Also, many Japanese would say that everyone gets worn down by their grueling commute, and we're all in it together, so we shouldn't complain. It's more important to try hard than actually produce results, and anyone who attempts to escape that idea becomes the target of criticism. Getting off the topic of crowded trains, in Japan, workers are expected to show up to work on time regardless of bad weather or train delays caused by accidents, and in some companies, workers will be berated by their bosses for such tardiness. This will give you an idea how important it is to be loyal to the company in Japan. But even with those practices, in recent years there has been a movement to reduce the crowded trains in Japan. Yuriko Koike, who became governor of Tokyo in 2016, made a revolutionary pledge to, quote, reduce overcrowded trains to zero, end quote, and won the election. Koike's proposal is based on a plan by the head of a transport consulting company. The plan was to make double-decked rail carriages and platforms to double their carrying capacity. However, some 7 years since Koike took office, the pledge has been unfulfilled. The consultant offered several other proposals. First, by reducing the time a train is stopped at a station, the number of trains running could be increased. The second was to abolish the current pattern of local trains stopping at every station and instead have several patterns of express trains to cover most stations, resulting in more trains running. The third was to improve the performance of the trains, reducing travel time to allow more trains. The fourth was to improve signaling systems to reduce wasted time and increase the number of trains. It's thought that all of these could be implemented at a lower cost than the double-decker plan, but it's unclear how many will be set in motion. The other thing that some thought could solve Japan's overcrowded trains was the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID pushed many Japanese companies to allow remote work for work where feasible without harmful effects and limiting commuting only to those who needed to. Japan never implemented COVID lockdowns due to constitutional restrictions, but the government issued emergency declarations calling on workers to stay home, and companies complied. In addition, the government also called on those who still commuted to avoid peak hours to disperse the load, and many companies complied. As a result, railroad companies reduced their operations, and the overcrowded trains almost completely disappeared during the pandemic. The problem that couldn't be solved for over a century was temporarily eliminated by the pandemic. However, this didn't last for long. It was thought that remote working and staggered hours would be part of normal commuting, but once the emergency declarations were called off, the overcrowded trains returned. Infection rates settled down and the virus was recognized to be only a minor threat, but before the turmoil ended, Japanese people were already back to commuting side by side with others. Of course, after the increase of remote work from the pandemic, many countries, along with Japan, saw a return to office commuting, but it is surprising that the overcrowded trains have returned even while the virus was still spreading. And most Japanese did not resist such decisions by companies and currents in society. On the other hand, other problems arose when companies allowed remote work just for some employees while requiring others to commute. Those who were required to commute claimed that it was unfair for them, and companies had no choice but to require all employees to commute. In other words, the Japanese public accepts everyone commuting even if there's a risk, but won't accept separate treatment just for some. This is probably due to the emphasis on social harmony and keeping the same pressures on all instead of special treatment for some. So now, the pandemic is under control and the city's trains are once again overcrowded. In addition, it's said that some railway operators are unable to restore the number of operating trains to previous levels, resulting in crowding that's higher than pre-COVID levels. Japan's population continues to decline, but there seems to be no solution to the overcrowded trains, the modern slave ships. What do you think of this problem? On this channel, we'll cover some of the lesser-known topics of Japanese culture. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe. We'll see you again next time.